It's time now for The Clash, in which we debate a big story of the day from opposing points of view. Middle-class cocaine users could have their passports and driving licences taken away in a government crackdown, according to Boris Johnson in an interview with today's Sun on Sunday. The PM said there's a group of people who use drugs to fuel a lifestyle without being sucked into the cycle of prison. These people think it's a victimless crime, but it's not. We're going to look at new ways of penalising them. He went on to say things that will actually interfere with their lives. So we'll look at taking away passports and driving licences. Ahead of a new drugs strategy to be announced tomorrow, the PM said there are two categories of people using illegal substances in the UK. Around 300,000 heroin and crack cocaine users who drive most drug-related crime and are constantly locked up and in need of rehabilitation. And a separate group who consume drugs recreationally without any noticeable problem, but who are feeding demand and supporting the drug dealers' business model. So what is the way forward? With colossal police resources spent pursuing recreational users, is it simply time to end the war on drugs? To debate this, I'm delighted to welcome public relations consultant Oscar Redrop, and I'll bring my panel in as well. Emma Webb, Charlie Peters and Andre Walker. Let me start with you, if I can, Oscar. Do you think that we should end the war on drugs, which other countries appear to have done?
No, I don't. I don't believe that's the right way forward. I have to say, in all fairness, today's news, in terms of the policy instrument, in terms of passport restrictions and the like, I think that's wrong. I think, however, the fact that we're talking about this issue is important. I have to say, there's been many a dinner party that I'm sure the middle classes, sit and they enjoy their £40 bottles of red wine.
Half the cabinet, Oscar.
well, may very well be. I won't speak on their behalf. And they talk about the free-range food they eat and all the amazing humanitarian causes they do. And they take Class A drugs, and we all know the supply chain of those Class A drugs results in the devastation and deaths of thousands of people across the world. That's hypocrisy for me. I think hypocrisy should always be looked at.
But, Oscar, just think of the hundreds of hours that police officers put into pursuing middle-class cokeheads and also people having the occasional marijuana spliff. I mean, these are not hardened criminals, are they? And I understand that their consumption of these substances feeds an industry, but it's not exactly the big game, is it?
No, they're not hardened criminals. But and so in that sense, I think maybe the policy solution is probably, a public awareness campaign. It's easy to forget, long before I was born probably, but nonetheless, drink driving at one point was accepted. And now those adverts, those visceral adverts we see day in, day out, it's completely unacceptable now. It's not involved in our day-to-day lives. And I think the same should be done with this issue. I think those middle-class drug users need to know that it isn't just an hour of fun for them, that actually there are repercussions and there are shockwaves throughout the world. If I may, just lastly, I worked very closely with Sean Bailey on his mayoral campaign. I know he's...
Congratulations, a very successful one.
Well, it was in the end, yeah. And part of that success was, there's not a politician that perhaps more in the UK that I would listen to more than on crime than Sean.
Yeah.
And he always told me it is always interlinked. It is always interlinked, hard users or soft.
But, Oscar, it sounds to me like you're recommending something similar to prohibition, where you're basically trying to get people to stop consuming the substance that they enjoy. And that's a very discredited policy. You're never going to stop people hoovering up the Colombian marching powder, are you?
Very, very nice term there, Mark. No, but I think...
Too much knowledge?
Not at all, not at all, not at all. But I think information is the key here. My core is probably aligned with yours in the sense that I do favour less government. I don't want nanny state. I don't think providing people with a strong message and telling them, hey, guys, you want to sit with your neighbours and talk about how amazing it is, the free-range chicken you just bought at Waitrose. Actually, and I'm sure, Mark, you probably agree, do you not want to stare those people down in the face and say, hey, when you take cocaine, there's actually people who are dying, and actually those people are dying to county lines, and they're dying far across the world in Colombia. You're not all that great. I mean, do you not take a bit of pleasure doing that, Mark?
Yeah, but you can't stare those people in the face because they're so twitchy and they're not great with eye contact. But I think you raise a really good point, Oscar. I mean, let's open it up to my brilliant panel tonight. Emma Webb, what do you think? Oscar raises a good point. This is an evil industry, and people that use drugs recreationally ought to know the consequences.
I think Oscar makes some very good points, and I certainly have never been particularly soft on drugs. However, I do think that the suggestions of doing things like taking measures of removing people's passports or their driving licences is too far. And we've seen this a lot over the last 18 months with all of the public health policy, this increasing sort of leaning towards a state that thinks that it can interfere with people's basic liberties in order to try and influence their behaviour. And I see this as being very much a part of that. And I think that it's very troubling that they would suggest the removal of people's passports in particular. I think that is a very worrying stance that they would even consider it. But I also don't think that we should be soft on drugs. So I share that tendency away from a bigger state towards a smaller state. But I also do think that it's important to recognise the harm that drugs have, not just on individuals at home and abroad, but also on communities and families as well. That the impact of drugs can be absolutely devastating, and it isn't something that should be taken lightly and just be viewed as something that is purely recreational.
But Emma, the current approach isn't working. We are losing the war on drugs. Why can't we be honest, like the Scandinavians, the Portuguese and the Dutch, and certain states in America as well?
I don't know. I'd have to see the statistics on that to know whether or not actually relaxing rules around drugs and legalisation of... I
know that drug deaths in Portugal have fallen since they decriminalised.
It might be that is a better way to try and deal with drug use, but I'm not entirely sure. And my concern would be that it would make drugs more accessible to those who otherwise wouldn't have access to it. And could potentially damage more lives. So I don't know exactly what the solutions are, but I don't think that taking people's passports away from them is one of them.
Gentlemen, I'll come to you shortly, but Oscar, back to you, your response to that.
I think, look, when you look across Europe, you know, we're all different populations.
Different cultures.
Different cultures, and I think sometimes it's naive to look to other nations and go, oh, why don't we just do that here? Why don't we just import that here? You know, this is the UK. You know, the crime rate, you know, that I was exposed to when I was working on that campaign in London genuinely shocked me. And 90% of it is down to drugs. And if even 10% of middle-class users is encouraging and feeding that awful, awful environment, then, you know, I don't think we can just hold our hands and give up. And you know what? And we all have to have a really long look in the mirror and actually ask ourselves, you know, have I played a passive or, you know, ultimately, have I played a small role in that? And I think that's a tough question. And I know that, you know, when Sean actually asked it during his election campaign in terms of, you know, doing random checking in offices and businesses with more than 250 people, it was interesting. You know, people didn't really like it. They didn't like that idea. And you have to kind of go, well, you know, why is that? And I think the answer is probably quite obvious to many of us. And I think we need to be honest and we have to have a tough conversation with ourselves. We can't give up on this issue.
Andre, I'll come to you shortly, but Charlie Peters, what's your view on this?
The war on drugs, it's the war we never fought, to quote Peter Hitchens. There's all this discussion about, oh, we've proven that prohibition doesn't work. It's time to move on to a softer alternative, perhaps a more continental approach. When actually, when you look at the hard facts, our approach towards hard drug use has been pretty pathetic throughout, especially in the more recent ministries. And I never, ever take the government seriously when they push these comms lines. I think what you're experiencing right now with this latest proposal is just a throwaway, back of a fag packet policy idea used to appeal to voters for no more than a week that will never come into fruition, because the fact of the matter is this government doesn't take drugs seriously. The one before it didn't, and the one before that also ignored the problem.
Andre Walker, you're very lucky because you're high on life.
I just love you. Look, you often see the police quote this statistic: we've got X amount of street value of drugs. The reason they use that statistic is because it makes it sound like they're more successful than they are. There was an article in The Economist recently that said a gram of cocaine in Colombia retails for 10 pence. Now, with all the muck that they put into it, it would be cut down and sold for £300 on the streets of London. So what they do is just machine gun huge amounts at the British border. The border agency says that 95% of cocaine gets through. And here's my fundamental point. Whether you are talking about drug use or not, the clear thing is that drug dealers are not illegal pharmacists. Their business model is to be a criminal gang. And if you legalise drugs, what would happen is Pfizer and people like that would destroy the drug dealers. These people are making absolutely billions. The prohibition is an unprecedented engorgement of a criminal class. Did you see the way the Italian mafia in New York died a death when prohibition ends? There has to be a point here about how much money we are handing over to dangerous criminals.
Yes, I mean, I'm drug-free, I'm pleased to say, Oscar, but I'd rather buy my drugs from Boots than from Sid on the third floor.
So I think, again, I think you are slightly living in cloud cuckoo land if you think that legalisation will mean drug dealers pack up, throw their hands up in the air and go, oh, you know what, I'm going to get a job down in, Tesco's or whatever. That life's not for me anymore. Fair play, guys. You take my business, it's done. That will not happen. The drug...
But it kills their business model.
Well, allow me to respond to that.
Get a couple of lines of cocaine from Costa.
Yeah, allow me to respond to that. Allow me to respond to that.
One of those millionaire shortbreads.
Sounds like a heart attack waiting to happen, that, Mark.
Andre?
It's not about actually thinking that these criminal elements will cease to be criminal elements. The point is that there is less money going into the system because they have less opportunities to make money. Certainly it was true when Prohibition ended in New York that the level of organised crime was reduced simply because they were less wealthy, because they had less opportunity to make money.
But this is what I think is specific, if I may, to middle-class drug use. I think the middle classes, at times, and don't get me wrong, I have seen it, I have been aware of it, there is this, the gift that being middle class gives you is, drug taking can be cool. And I think when you legalise drugs, and it is walking into the Boots, all of a sudden it isn't cool anymore. And actually, so to my point, I think they still want to. Illegal drug users would still make money from the middle classes. And I think, again, this is another reason why this is not a demographic that we should just let carry on and do exactly as they please. They see it as cool, and I think that has to end.
I mean, it is a national security issue, isn't it? Considering the business model that surrounds the drug industry, the drug trade, Emma, supports terrorism and a lot of international foreign bad actors.
Absolutely. I mean, it's connected to human trafficking, all sorts of crime all across the world. So, and in many cases, not just with drug taking, small actions that individuals take connect to a larger network, a domino effect of really, really terrible things. But I don't think that's necessarily the primary, or at least it wouldn't be a motivating factor, I think, for the individual when it comes to drug taking or their view on drug taking. I think the thing that really is much closer to home is the sorts of effects that this has on people's families. People who have addicts in their families will know that this is something that can be absolutely, utterly devastating to families and communities all around the country. And I think the concern would be that if you were to take that risk of legalising drugs, for example, that actually we don't know what the implications of that might be, and it may make it easier for people to access drugs where they wouldn't have otherwise been able to, and it may destroy lives at home, never mind the international criminal networks behind it. So I think this is a much, much more complicated issue than we're even able to give it due time for. But I think that ultimately, as Charlie put it, it's a back of the fag packet policy proposal. Suggesting things like removing passports or other particularly draconian measures, I think actually will turn people off of what otherwise might be a sensible argument to be a little tough on drug use.
Can I just say this, though? I do think that if you are somebody who is a hard drug user on a regular basis, I think taking the driving licence, not as a punishment, might be a wise move.
Yeah.
That's not a bad shout. And by the way, I wonder, Oscar, whether policymakers are guilty of hypocrisy, because the Sunday Mirror newspaper are reporting this evening that the House of Commons Speaker Lindsay Hoyle is going to contact police about a report that said cocaine has been found in several lavatory areas of Westminster Palace. He pledged to raise the issue with the Met Police and says that those who flout the law should face punishment. One of the 12 lavatory areas in Parliament that was tested showed traces of cocaine, according to the Sunday Times. The House of Commons, which is responsible for the running of the Palace of Westminster, the Commission of the House of Commons, was considering allowing the use of sniffer dogs to detect users. I mean, this problem is everywhere in our society, including in the corridors of power.
It's quite interesting timing, that, isn't it? The rushed-out policy press release from the government, and then this coming out. Now, what I would say is I worked in Parliament for around 8 months during COVID, so, God, it feels a long time ago now.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, Lindsay Hoyle is a really, I think, skilled, really skilled guy, and I think he will get to the bottom of this. Pretty sharpish, actually, so we may see some interesting results. It does bring me back to the Conservative leadership election in 2019. Did we not all find it a little bit cringe? It felt like they were queuing up to almost declare that at some point they may or may not have taken illegal drugs. I wonder if we're going to see the media rounds of a similar nature in the coming days and weeks.
Fascinating conversation. What's your view? Are we losing the war on drugs? Should we end it? My thanks to PR consultant Oscar Reddrop and my panel of Emma, Charlie and Andre, who return at 10:40 for more big stories of the day in our news agenda. We've asked you your opinion on Twitter, and here are the results of our Twitter poll. 56.3% say yes, we should end the war on drugs. A slight majority there, 43.7%, say no.